Before you scroll past, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like your efforts meant nothing? Like the years you spent helping others were forgotten? This is the story of a woman who thought her life's work had been wasted until one ordinary day proved her wrong. But before we begin, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because stories like this remind us why kindness, patience, and purpose still matter. Mrs. Adebayo sat upright on the narrow wooden bench, her back stiff with the discipline of someone who had spent most of her life standing before restless students. Her handbag rested firmly on her lap, both hands folded over it, as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded in the crowded hall. The place was already full when she arrived, too full. Men and women of different shapes and sizes squeezed into the limited seats, their knees brushing, their elbows bumping, their patience thinning with every passing minute. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and old clothes that had been carefully pressed for an important day. A ceiling fan creaked above them, spinning lazily, moving warm air from one corner to another without offering any real relief. On her right sat a man whose stomach pushed proudly against the buttons of his shirt, round and firm like a drum pulled too tight. He breathed heavily, as though sitting alone required effort. On her left was a thin woman who had not removed her phone from her ear since she arrived. She spoke loudly, laughing loudly, reacting dramatically to every word coming from the other end of the line.
Mrs. Adebayo shut her eyes for a moment. This was not how she imagined retirement. When she was younger, standing before chalkboards and noisy classrooms, she had imagined peace at this age. Quiet mornings, a small garden, respect. Maybe the occasional visit from former students who had grown into something meaningful. Not this. Not sitting on a hard bench in a poorly ventilated government hall, waiting endlessly to be verified, like a document that could be misplaced or forgotten. The notice had said 9 a.m. sharp. It was already past 11. She wiped the thin layer of sweat forming on her forehead with a handkerchief she had folded neatly in her bag. Her movements were slow, deliberate, habits built over decades of maintaining composure even when everything inside her wanted to break loose. If she had known life would turn out this way, she would never have become a teacher. The thought came uninvited, but once it arrived, it refused to leave. Years of standing on cracked classroom floors, years of shouting over noise, years of marking scripts until her fingers ached, years of correcting children whose parents would later storm into school, shouting, pointing fingers, insisting their precious child could do no wrong. Parents who believed discipline was abuse, parents who believed teachers were servants, parents who forgot that their children spent more waking hours with teachers than with them. And the pay. She scoffed inwardly. A salary that barely survived the month. Promotions that came late or never. Promises that dissolved with every new government. And now, in retirement, a pension that arrived whenever it pleased, as though it were a favor, not a right. Her jaw tightened. The woman beside her burst into laughter again, louder this time, her voice sharp and careless. No, I told him already. That man is mad, I swear. The sound pierced through Mrs. Adebayo's thoughts like a needle. She shifted slightly on the bench, hoping the woman would get the hint. She didn't. Instead, the woman raised her voice even higher, pressing the phone harder to her ear as though shouting would improve the connection. Mrs. Adebayo exhaled slowly through her nose. Patience, she told herself. Patience. But patience had been her companion for too long. The hall buzzed with murmurs. Some people found themselves with documents. Others leaned forward anxiously, watching the entrance as though the long-awaited official might appear if they stared hard enough. Then the man beside her spoke. They said the officer had a family emergency. His voice was thick and slow, the kind that carried without effort. He shifted on the bench, causing it to creak. Mrs. Adebayo turned to him. "Which officer?" He belched softly before answering, the smell of garlic floating in the air. She resisted the urge to cover her nose. "The one meant to attend to us, Mr. Anosike, I think." She scoffed. "So because he has a family problem, all of us should sit here and waste our day?" The man shrugged. "That's what they said." She clicked her tongue. "Is he the only one trained for this work? There's no one else that can attend to us?" Before he could answer, the woman on the phone let out another loud laugh, this one sharper, longer, almost mocking. Something snapped. Mrs. Adebayo turned sharply toward her. "You, this woman, do you know you're in a public place? Why are you shouting like someone who has lost her senses?"
The hall went quiet. Heads turned. The woman froze, phone still pressed to her ear. Slowly, she lowered it and stared at Mrs. Adebayo, eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you talking to me?" she asked. "Yes," Mrs. Adebayo replied calmly. "This is an official space. If you must take a call, at least have the decency to lower your voice." The woman scoffed. "Madam, mind your business. You can't tell me how to speak." Before Mrs. Adebayo could respond, the man beside her cleared his throat. "Madam," he said, looking at her pointedly, "are you even a teacher? Because the way you've been talking since morning, you sound like a market woman." A few people chuckled. Her face burned. Another woman, dressed in Ankara, with tribal marks faintly etched on her cheeks, stepped closer. "She's right though. You've been disturbing everyone with your loud phone call. We can all hear you." The phone woman hissed, stood up abruptly, and gathered her bag. "Nonsense people," she muttered, walking away. Mrs. Adebayo allowed herself a small breath of relief. But it didn't last. Almost immediately, another woman dropped into the empty space, broad-shouldered, muscular, wrapped in Iro and Buba. She squeezed between Mrs. Adebayo and the fat man without apology. Mrs. Adebayo stiffened. She glanced at the woman's arms, solid and firm, and suddenly imagined her as a former physical education teacher backing instructions on a dusty field. She sighed aloud. "If I had known, I wouldn't have been a teacher." The new woman turned sharply. So did the man. "Madam, is there a problem?" the muscular woman asked. Mrs. Adebayo's voice trembled with restrained anger. "We are sitting here, sweating, waiting for someone who doesn't respect our time, under a system that treats us like we are nothing. Is that not a problem?" The woman studied her, then shook her head. "You should be grateful." Mrs. Adebayo laughed, short and bitter. "Grateful? For what?" The man chuckled. "You talk as if you are not African. If you know how many people wish they had your opportunity, you won't be talking like this," the woman added. "Opportunity," Mrs. Adebayo repeated softly, tasting the word. She leaned back, eyes heavy, and that was when the hall suddenly went quiet. The murmurs died down almost instantly. It was not announced. No one clapped, no one called for attention, yet somehow the entire hall seemed to sense the shift in the air. Footsteps echoed faintly from the entrance. Mrs. Adebayo lifted her head, more out of irritation than curiosity. She had already decided that whoever was coming would be just another official with excuses stitched neatly to their tongue. A tall woman walked in, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. She wore a fitted black skirt suit, simple but commanding, the kind that did not need bright colors to demand respect. Her posture was straight, her movements assured.
Behind her followed 2 men and a woman, all carrying files, all walking a step behind her. The room straightened. Chairs creaked as people adjusted their sitting positions. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the ceiling fan seemed to hum quieter. "Good morning," the woman said. Her voice was calm, steady, unforced. "Good morning, ma'am," the hall responded in near-perfect unison. Mrs. Adebayo didn't join in immediately. She merely watched. The woman scanned the hall slowly, her eyes moving from face to face. There was something in the way she looked at them, not with pity, not with superiority, but with recognition, as though she understood exactly why they were there. "I sincerely apologize for the delay. I understand how frustrating it must have been waiting this long. The officer assigned to today's verification had a sudden family emergency, and there was a failure in communication." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. "We should have handled it better," she continued. "For that, I take responsibility." That was when Mrs. Adebayo looked up fully. Not because of the apology, but because of the tone. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't defensive, it didn't sound like the usual government speech.
The woman paused briefly, then added, "You've all served this state. Some of you gave over 30 years of your lives in classrooms, shaping futures you may never even see. You deserve respect." Something in Mrs. Adebayo's chest tightened. She shifted on the bench, suddenly aware of how closely she was listening. The woman took a step forward. "My name is Feishayo Omorodion. I oversee this department, and I'll personally ensure that today's process moves faster than it has." There was a faint stir of recognition among the crowd. Some whispered her name to one another. Others nodded slowly, as if connecting dots. Mrs. Adebayo didn't react. She had long stopped caring about titles. But then, "Mrs. Adebayo." The voice was different now, softer, sharper. The hall went silent. Mrs. Adebayo blinked. "Mrs. Adebayo," the woman repeated, her eyes fixed on her. Slowly, Mrs. Adebayo raised her head. "Yes," she said cautiously. The woman's face changed. Her eyes widened. Her lips parted slightly, as though she had just seen a ghost. "Oh my God," she whispered. She took a step forward. "Mrs. Adebayo?" A ripple of confusion spread across the hall. The woman abandoned her composed posture and walked quickly toward the bench before anyone could react. She bent slightly and took Mrs. Adebayo's hands in hers. "Ma'am, it's me, Feishayo." Mrs. Adebayo stared at her. The face was familiar, but distant, younger, polished by years and power and life. I'm sorry," Mrs. Adebayo said slowly. "Do I know you?" The woman laughed softly, though her eyes were wet. "Feishayo Omorodion, but you used to call me Faye. I sat in the front row, biology class, St. Mary's Secondary School." The world tilted. Images flooded back. Rows of wooden desks, chalk dust on her fingers. A girl with curious eyes who always raised her hand, who stayed back to ask questions, who borrowed textbooks and returned them neatly wrapped. "Feishayo," Mrs. Adebayo whispered. "Yes, ma." A few gasps rippled through the room. The woman squeezed her hands gently. "You taught me when I didn't believe I was smart enough. You told me I could become anything. You stayed back after school to explain photosynthesis to me because I kept failing the test." Mrs. Adebayo's throat tightened. I remember you, she said softly now. The woman smiled through tears. You changed my life. The hall was completely silent. I heard you were coming today. I didn't know I would find you here. When they told me your name, I didn't believe it. She turned to the officials behind her. Please, make sure Mrs. Adebayo is attended to immediately. Then lowering her voice, she added, She's with me. A murmur swept through the room. Mrs. Adebayo felt heat rush to her face. I don't need special treatment, she began, but Feishayo shook her head. You deserve it, she said gently. All of you do. She turned back to the hall. We'll attend to everyone today. No one is leaving without being attended to. The tension in the room loosened. Some smiled, some sighed, some simply watched in awe. Mrs. Adebayo sat frozen, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The muscular woman beside her stared openly. The fat man swallowed hard, and suddenly the word spoken earlier returned to her mind. You should be grateful. Mrs. Adebayo closed her eyes. For the first time that day, she didn't feel tired. Mrs. Adebayo did not realize that she had stood up until she felt the slight ache in her knees. Feishayo had taken her hand gently, guiding her away from the bench. The hall parted without instruction. People shifted aside instinctively, some out of respect, others out of curiosity. Eyes followed them as they walked, whispers trailing behind like soft echoes. The same bench that felt like a burden minutes ago now seemed distant. Mrs. Adebayo walked slowly, her steps careful. Feishayo matched her pace without rushing her, without pulling. I'm sorry, Feishayo said quietly as they moved. You shouldn't have had to wait like that. Mrs. Adebayo shook her head. Waiting is something I'm used to. They reached the entrance of the hall. Outside, the sun sat high in the sky, bright and unforgiving. A car was parked nearby, sleek and dark, its doors already open. Feishayo stopped beside it, but did not enter.
Instead, she turned to Mrs. Adebayo. I never forgot you, she said, even when life became busy, even when I moved away, even when things started happening fast. Mrs. Adebayo studied her face. The sharp confidence was new. The composure, the authority, those were things life had carved into her. But beneath all that, she could still see the girl who once sat at the front of her class, eyes bright with curiosity, hands raised before the question was even finished. You were always asking questions, Mrs. Adebayo said slowly, always hungry to know more. Feishayo smiled. Because you told me curiosity was not a weakness. They stood in silence for a moment. The sound of distant voices drifted from the hall. Somewhere inside, papers were being shuffled. A fan hummed. Life went on. I almost didn't become what I am today, Feishayo said softly. Mrs. Adebayo looked at her. My parents wanted me to stop school after secondary education. They said it was enough, that a girl didn't need too much education. She laughed faintly. But you called me aside one afternoon and told me something I never forgot. Mrs. Adebayo frowned slightly, trying to remember. You said if the world tries to shrink you, don't make yourself smaller to fit it. The words landed heavily. Mrs. Adebayo's lips parted slightly. I said that? Yes, ma. Feishayo nodded. You said education was my way out, that no one could take knowledge from me once I had it. Mrs. Adebayo felt her chest tighten.
She had said those words to many students over the years. She never imagined they would follow someone this far. I went back home that day and told my father I would continue school. He was angry, but I didn't back down. And when things became hard, I remembered you standing in front of the class, chalk in hand, refusing to give up on us. Her voice wavered slightly. So yes, when I saw your name today, I came immediately. Mrs. Adebayo swallowed hard. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she exhaled. All these years, she murmured, I thought it was all for nothing. Feisayo shook her head firmly. No, ma, it was never for nothing. They stood there, two women from different generations, bound by a classroom that no longer existed, by lessons that had traveled farther than either of them knew. Behind them, someone cleared their throat. The muscular woman from earlier stood awkwardly nearby, her face uncertain. The fat man lingered behind, pretending not to listen. Ma, the woman said hesitantly, they said we should start coming in now. Feisayo nodded. Yes, everyone will be attended to. She turned back to Mrs. Adebayo. Please sit close to the front. I'll make sure everything goes smoothly. Mrs. Adebayo hesitated. Then she smiled faintly. All right.
As they walked back into the hall together, the atmosphere had changed. People sat straighter. Conversations softened. Hope, thin but present, filled the room. Mrs. Adebayo returned to her seat, not as an invisible old woman this time, but as someone seen, as someone remembered, as someone who had mattered. She sat down slowly, her hands resting on her lap, and for the first time that day, she did not feel tired. She felt full. The hall no longer felt the same. It was still crowded. The air was still warm, the benches were still hard, but something invisible had shifted, like a weight had been lifted from the room. Mrs. Adebayo sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, watching as names were called one after another. Files moved faster now. Officials spoke with purpose. The chaos that had ruled the morning gave way to order. But her mind was elsewhere. She kept replaying the words in her head. You changed my life. She had said things like that to students countless times. Encouraging words spoken in passing, sometimes out of duty, sometimes out of instinct. She never imagined any of them would carry such weight years later. Around her, murmurs of recognition grew. That's her? So that woman is her teacher? No wonder she took her hand like that. The muscular woman beside her shifted uncomfortably. Madam, she said softly, I didn't know you were... Mrs. Adebayo smiled faintly. Neither did I. The woman nodded slowly, as though processing something larger than the moment. Further down the bench, the fat man cleared his throat. You see, life is funny. Mrs. Adebayo didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her eyes drifted toward the open door where sunlight poured in. The same sun she had walked under for decades, going to school every morning, rain or shine. The same sun she had stood under during morning assemblies, watching rows of children recite pledges they barely understood. All those years, all that effort, she had thought it disappeared into nothing. But here it was, walking in heels, speaking with authority, changing things. Her chest tightened again. A clerk called her name, Mrs. Adebayo. She stood up slowly and walked forward. This time, she did not feel small. Her documents were checked quickly, Her details confirmed, her file stamped. "You are cleared, ma'am," the young man said politely. She nodded. As she turned to leave, she saw Feisayo watching her from across the hall. Their eyes met. Feisayo smiled. Mrs. Adebayo lifted her hand slightly in acknowledgement, and then she walked out. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. She stood for a moment, letting the breeze touch her face. The noise of the street blended with the sound of distant voices from the hall behind her. For years, she had carried bitterness quietly. Bitterness for the system, for the delays, for the disrespect, for the forgotten sacrifices. But now, standing there, she realized something that surprised her. Not everything had been in vain. She thought of the classroom, the chalk-stained fingers, the restless students, the lessons taught even when she was tired, the encouragement she gave without knowing who would listen. She smiled softly. Perhaps the reward of a teacher was not in money. Perhaps it was in moments like this.
In seeing what had grown from seeds planted long ago, she adjusted her bag on her shoulder and began to walk away. As she did, the words she had spoken earlier returned to her mind. "If I had known, I wouldn't have been a teacher." She shook her head slowly. No. If she had known, she would still have chosen the same path. Mrs. Adebayo walked slowly down the steps outside the hall, her shoes tapping softly against the concrete. The sun had shifted slightly now, no longer harsh, just warm enough to remind her that the day was still young. She paused for a moment. People passed her without knowing who she was. To them, she was just another elderly woman leaving a government building. Another retired teacher. Another face in the crowd. And yet, she felt different, lighter. As she stood there, she thought of all the moments she had nearly given up. The days she went to school hungry, the time she marked scripts late into the night, the insults from parents who thought teachers were failures, the months her salary came late, the years her pension did not come at all. She had thought none of it mattered, but today had proven her wrong.
She remembered how she had complained earlier that morning, how she had snapped at strangers, how she had said she wished she had never been a teacher. And yet, the very child she once corrected with patience had grown into a woman who now carried authority, a woman who stood tall, a woman who remembered. Mrs. Adebayo smiled to herself. Life, she realized, had a strange way of returning what you gave it, sometimes late, sometimes quietly, sometimes when you least expected it. She had spent years believing her impact was invisible, but impact, she now understood, does not always announce itself. Sometimes it walks into a room wearing a black suit. Sometimes it calls you ma'am with trembling respect. Sometimes it simply looks at you and says, "You changed my life." She adjusted her bag and began to walk home. Behind her, the hall continued buzzing with voices and movement. Ahead of her was the road she had walked for decades, steady, familiar, honest. And as she walked away that day, one truth settled gently in her heart. Sometimes the seeds you plant don't grow where you can see them. Sometimes they grow in people. If this story touched you, let it remind you of one thing. Your efforts are not wasted. Your kindness is not forgotten, and the good you do today may return to you in ways you never imagined. If you believe that, tap the like button. If you've ever had a teacher, mentor, or stranger who changed your life, drop a comment and honor them. And if you want more stories that restore faith in purpose, people, and patience, subscribe now and stay with us. Because sometimes the smallest seeds grow into the greatest stories.